not believe in a man who's lying to them. And it is not my job to extend empathy or sympathy to people who feel that way. I don't know how to meet a bigot in the middle. So if that is how people feel, start there. Start there at your own table.
That brings up an interesting question, because I do think that's a question I get on the road a bunch. Are you ever able to change somebody's mind or what have you? And that's not the intention of the pieces that we go out to do. I think more often than not, it's to confront people with logical fallacies that we see back home and see what the reality is in the field. But I do think it's interesting, as somebody, a member of the media, there is this chasm here. There's a chasm also of bad information that people are getting. And I do think you want to have empathy for those people who have been given such misinformation. How do you balance the deliverance of real news with the idea of showing a certain amount of empathy and outreach towards perhaps voices and people who aren't willing to meet in the middle?
Well, I would challenge the first part of empathy. I think if you do have empathy, Jordan, for some of the folks you have spoken with, that's not such a bad thing. Perhaps I can understand that, as long as you're not asking me to have empathy. I do not have empathy for people who have bought into a lie or a myth or a system that means my oppression. I don't have any empathy for such people at all. I actually think the country would be better off without those people having an influence on what this democracy looks like or how this government works. But that is not the way American democracy was designed. I think when it comes to reporting these things in the media landscape, you run the risk of having a large number of the population, I would call the rising majority, tune you out when your perspective, when the starting point is, we have empathy for these people who feel this way. Because you do not hear people saying, well, look, the Nazis were fed a bunch of bad information. We have to have empathy for them. Get the fuck out of here. Like, we would never say that. We would never believe that, And so why am I being asked to have empathy for the people who would see me staying in a dilapidated community, sending my children to dilapidated schools, living in rundown neighborhoods, and say, well, that's just how it goes, because they can't win, because if they win, that means I'm losing. I have no empathy.
Tiffany, I gotta say, if you don't think people are showing empathy towards Nazis, you're just not on Twitter anymore.
You're right. On Elon Musk Twitter, it is the land of empathy for Nazis.
I would say it's a surprisingly popular opinion that's really somehow coming back in vogue. I guess I have a question. Who makes those decisions about what gets covered and what doesn't get covered at a network level? Is it anchors? Is it producers, news executives? Is there a conversation that happens in the newsroom?
Well, it's a variety of things, and I think it all depends on the newsroom. Broadcast has a different set of rules than print. When I was in cable news, I made the decisions about what I covered on my show, but I did not do so without a fight. There are assignment editors, and there are people who oversee, and people who oversaw my show. And it was always a fight because, it's like the echo chambers, right? Like the three news networks are covering mostly the same things. Every now, Fox would be an outlier and, still cover Hillary's emails. But for the most part, people were covering the same stories throughout the day. I was very intentional about disrupting that and talking about stories that impacted communities of color, policy, people who live below the poverty line. I wanted to have conversations that were being had in the corner office, as well as the barbershop, as well as the beauty salon, as well as on the block, for the old men who sit outside in front of the, convenience store all day. I wanted everyone to feel like they had a home, and I wanted to reflect the lived experience of everyone. Well, we talked a lot on this show about the tragedy of America's maternal mortality rates, especially the disparity that claims Black and Indigenous women at 3 times the rate as white women. Imagine being without clean water for 6 straight days. Well, that's the reality right now for the 150,000 residents of Mississippi's largest city. All right, after centuries of genocide and oppression, imagine seeing your ancestors' stolen belongings sit in a museum and you're told you can't have them, you can't touch them, or even photograph them. You take something even as simple as the economy, right? A lot of people, in these morning news shows, and they say, oh, the economy is doing well, the market is up. And it's like the market is not the economy. And if you go and talk to people in my pre-gentrified neighborhood, they would not say the economy is doing well. You take labor reports and they're like, oh, we added X amount of new jobs and here's the unemployment numbers. Well, that's the overall unemployment numbers. But when you disaggregate that data and look at unemployment for Black people, for Latino people, we feel disrespected when you say, oh, know the jobs reports numbers are great. And so the more that people kind of centralize white perspective and white voices, it leaves so many people out. And so when you talk about newsroom diversity and who makes these decisions, don't come tell me that you just hired, 50% of people of color and women, and they're all entry-level employees or mid-level management. Put those people in the C-suite, put those people in decision-making positions so they can disrupt the echo chambers in a meaningful way. Because what is a 25-year-old to do when a 55-year-old is in charge of the entire newsroom and they're making a decision that runs contrary to the lived experience or belief system or experiences of the rising majority? They don't always have or feel the sense of agency to challenge that. And so when they don't have that, they either exit the business or they become a part of this machine that keeps doing the same thing over and over, and it never gets disrupted or changed forever.
Those battles that you're having in the newsroom with your show on MSNBC, The Cross Connection, how much did you have to split your time being the host of that show, helping create the narrative of that show, the stories you wanted to cover, and also what sounds like a teacher of this experience?
Yeah.
Did you find yourself having to put on those two hats, and were you surprised by that culture at MSNBC?
Yes, I put on those hats every day. And so what I found on my show is I would have to do something to please network executives. And then I would have to do the rest of my program to please the viewers. And those things often went like this. If I was going to please the executives, fine, I will do 2 segments on Trump because that's what everybody wanted. The network executives wanted to talk about Trump. However, if one of the members of the group Migos was murdered, well, that was something that a lot of people were talking about, especially on the heels of so many other hip hop artists being murdered. So that was going to be something to please viewers. If there was a story about indigenous communities, having to travel over 2 hours to vote, that was something that was going to please viewers. If we were going to do something on the Asian American Pacific Islander community being the fastest growing demographic in the country, but yet no political parties are reaching out to them, that was something that was going to please viewers. And so, the way my bank account was set up, I had to at least do some things to please network executives, but it was always my mission, and I would encourage, anybody who wants to pursue any career, when you are mission driven, and I was mission driven, and my mission was for the equality and liberation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the rising majority of the country. That was my mission. And so nothing was going to sway me from that mission. And I knew if I ever fell out of favor with network executives, that would have to be okay, because my mission was to elevate the lived experiences and to hold the line for the people who were very much architects of this country and very much deserve to have their voices and perspectives heard, particularly after centuries of being so violently silenced.
Now, your show was canceled days before the midterms.
4 days.
4 days before the midterms. An important voice in this conversation. It made a lot of news, and there were a lot of questions. How much did you find that your personal mission was out of touch with whatever MSNBC's mission was?
I felt that pretty early on. Every week I had to defend and fight for segments that we did. Did that feel contrary to what other hosts at MSNBC were having to do with their own shows? Yeah. I would say my colleague Joy Reid and I probably had the most pushback on our shows. But there were also things that other hosts would do that would make it easier for us, which again is problematic. My colleague Ari Melber, is a big hip hop fan. If you watch 5 minutes of his show, you know that. He quotes rap lyrics all the time. And it was fine when the white man did it. When the white man did it, it made it easier for everybody else to do it. But let the Black woman start out doing that, and it would have been a major problem. But he was celebrated for doing that.
Tiffany, it was never fine when Ari Melber did that. It was never fine. That was never accepted amongst the audience members.
Well, he used to get rap artists on his show, and they seem to play into it. But either way, you look at Morning Joe, my former colleagues Joe and Mika. We got the term Moscow Mitch from Joe Scarborough. But if Joy or I, were to say something similar, it was like, hey, we don't really want name calling. But even if you take it out of MSNBC and just look at the media landscape in general, and some of the more colloquial conversations that happen when it comes to voters, there were so often in the media landscape that you would hear terms like soccer moms, NASCAR dads. Well, those were all euphemisms for white voters. And it's not that Black people could not, have that same moniker as well, but we understood what those terms meant. It did not feel inclusive of the Black experience, which is the biggest voting bloc when it comes to the Democratic Party. And so even when they did Voters of the Heartland, you go to these diners in the middle of nowhere where apparently no Black people have ever been or ever eaten, and that was Voters of the Heartland. But why not go to a basketball game in Southwest Atlanta after it let out and talk to the parents there? Are they not Voters of the Heartland in a purple state, I'd add? Why can't we have like basketball dads or, the auntie voting block or something that reflects my lived experience? Even when you have candidates on and you'd have, these Democratic candidates and the anchor would always press them. How are you going to appeal to these red state voters? How are you going to, get these Trump voters who feel homeless? How are they going to come over to you? I have yet to see somebody ask a Republican MAGA voter, how are you going to appeal? You want to penetrate Democratic Party. How are you going to appeal? The base vote are Black voters. Your party seems to stand for a lot of things that runs contrary to what Black voters want. How are you going to appeal to them? How are you going to appeal to the changing demographics? People of color are increasingly becoming the base vote. What are your policies that speak to that demographic? Those things never happened. I was never able to get Republicans to come out on my show because they did not want to answer those types of questions. But Access Journalism would grant you an interview with Ted Cruz or Marjorie Taylor Greene or the Senate candidate, Ron Johnson, the Trump acolyte who was running for Senate in Wisconsin. He would happily go on those shows if he knew it was going to be an easy interview. And that does not serve anybody but the anchor itself. It certainly does not serve viewers or voters.
And you bring up an interesting point. It is in 2016, after the media landscape was quote unquote surprised by the red wave, the Trumpism there was all you saw was anchors in these small little diners, and now we have this midterm election where everybody's shocked by the blue, whether you call it the blue pushback right there. But we're not seeing anybody go to these other Democratic areas and try to figure them out. I guess. Right. I think you're hitting on something that I think there are a lot of perhaps progressives out there who look at a place, who look at the media landscape. Everybody's picking their own media outlets to try to tell them perhaps the story that they think, one, elucidates the world that they see, or the story that makes them feel better about themselves more often than not. There are those places in the mass media market that people look at. And we don't have to go all in on MSNBC, but I do know that is a place for a lot of people who look at that as having a left-leaning perspective, who will take in a lot of these considerations. And I think hearing some of your stories here is depressing to hear that even these ideas of being inclusive in the stories that we tell is meeting such resistance at these levels. Like, where do you see these stories being able to be told? Clearly, we know where they need to be able to be told. Where are you seeing examples of them being told?
Well, I think social media has really democratized who has a voice in this space, which has come with great benefits to democracy, but also to some of our demise, right? Like we talked a little bit about Twitter, which, you have superstars on Twitter who we really don't know who they are. We just know their avatar. You have people who just create these YouTube shows who can just declare themselves journalists who might not have the journalistic acumen to really interview. The podcast Drink Champs, and they had Kanye on that podcast. Well, that wasn't a journalist, that was somebody having a drink with Kanye. So there wasn't the space to challenge some of the things that he said. And so I think the good thing about it is their space, and it has made everybody wake up and say, well, wait a second. A lot of people are getting their news from other places, like The Daily Show, quite honestly. And I have been a long time fan of The Daily Show, but I do think, well, that should not be your only news outlet. You do have to supplement that. Even my show, when people would say, I don't watch any news except for your show, it would make me a little nervous because it's like, well, I'm a prospective host, and I'm giving you my perspective. It would be helpful if you had some of the baseline stuff. And you and I both know print drives broadcast. Print journalism drives broadcast journalism. Everybody starts out reading the paper. Read 6, 7, 8 papers. But even there's a lack of newsroom diversity. So I don't know that I can say where news should be consumed. I would say the best answer I could give to that is stay tuned to where I land.
A final question in here. Do you think the media is glad Trump's running again?
I do. I think Trump gave the cable news network such a boom that they salivated. And that's why I think they were always constantly trying to get me to do Trump. You have to talk about Trump. But I think they're going to be disappointed. I have seen some in the news media, a day late and a dollar short, be a little more mindful about how they cover him. But I also think that the American body politic has lost their appetite for the reality TV show that was cable news. For a brief moment in time, people love to see, this throwdown, this battle, this kind of gutter back and forth between opposing viewpoints. It was like the anchor would do all but say, let's get ready to rumble. And then you bring in this, segment. I think post-pandemic and being overly sensationalized by this level of yellow journalism from print to broadcast has left people a bit apathetic towards consuming news at all.
Yeah. Well, Tiffany, I'm excited to see where you land. That is definitely going to be the place to check out. Thank you for coming on, and thank you everybody else for checking out this episode of Jordan Klepper Figures the Conspiracy. Whether you're listening on your phone or watching on your laptop, especially if it's a laptop at a repair shop in Delaware, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jordan.
Listen to Jordan Klepper Figures the Conspiracy from The Daily Show on Apple Podcasts, the iHeartRadio app, or wherever you get your podcasts.